just finished up my first ever game of the No Peace Without Spain system using a pragmatic war, the War of Austrian Succession, 1741 to 1748. Here's the rules and the cover. Pragmatic War. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was fantastic. It was super tense. And just very evocative of the period. I came in concerned. Some people have called the system a little dry, or that the scale sort of obfuscates some of the detail. But I think this game is really, really good. It's a card-driven game. About the War of Austrian Succession, obviously, I was playing as the Pragmatic Alliance, so I was the Hanoverian British, I was the Piedmontese, and the Austrians who are here and up there, obviously. And my opponent was the French Bourbon Alliance, so the French, the Prussians, the Genoese, and the Spaniards. It was a really, really great back and forth affair. The game ended as a minor Bourbon French victory, but on the final turn, I was up here in this region, and the victory swung back and forth several times. No one achieved auto victory, but we were hovering around that 20-point cutoff threshold for each side, and going into the final card play. And had the turn, so the final turn of the game, 1748, actually has a variable ending. Had that gone differently, I actually might have won as the Pragmatics. But either way, it was a really close, really tense time. The scope of the game is very cool. You get a lot of the shifting War of Austrian Succession stuff happening. So, for example, Bavaria and the HRE start the game allied to France, and all of this is and Saxony for that matter is friendly to French, and they can go on the offensive against Austria, who has very little defense, and it's very scary because as they get closer to Vienna to potentially auto win the game, you're low on troops, you have not great leaders. And then Maria Theresa, appeals to the Hungarians. You get some reinforcements. Suddenly other countries start coming into the game. The Piedmontese come into the game on the side of the Pragmatics. And you've got the Kingdom of Naples and Spain. They're kind of moving around. And then you get the Dutch and the British coming into play on the side of the Pragmatics. And suddenly stuff starts to change. The Prussians may or may not exit the game permanently, but a lot of the early action it takes place in Austria with the French and the Prussians in Silesia. And then at some point, more than likely, Frederick's going to leave and the Prussians go away. And then suddenly the pressure is off of Austria and they can kind of come back against the French. Prussia may come back. They may leave again. In our game, in the event card phase, Prussia came back, I believe, in 1745. Prussia came back, and then they immediately left again. So Frederick playing games with the Bourbon Alliance. The game is a card-driven game that uses cards. Here, there are two types of cards. There are ops or action cards, and there are event cards here. And now, initially, I was not, hearing about this, I wasn't a fan. I'm not a big fan of Washington's War, which kind of has a very similar kind of thing where, a card either has an event or an ops on it. But in this game, it's actually done differently. So in this game, you only have a hand of action cards. And your action cards determine how many things you can do on a given turn. They range between 1 and 4. There's only 1 4 card in the deck, but most of the cards are 1s and 2s. And you get 5 of those a turn, and then you use those to move around the map, do sieges on these fortified spaces, refresh units and stuff like that. And then also at the beginning of every turn, each side draws a card from the event deck. And some of these event cards they hold until played, and they stay in your hand, and they let you do things. You get bad weather, or you get cavalry charges and stuff like that. But some cards are just a global effect. And no matter what you draw, if it's a global effect, you have to play it. So you can see here in 1746 or 1747, we had the capture of Louisburg in North America that gave me 3 victory points. And here's some of the Frederick in and out of the game happening. Overall, it feels really good. I thought that I would hate not having to choose between ops and events, but I actually really like the way this happens because you're always guaranteed certain events will happen. And a lot of the hold cards are actually very powerful, and so you want to use them. And then, having just a hand of action cards, you're strategizing about, okay, when do I deploy my big card? When do I deploy my small card? How can I sucker my opponent into thinking I don't have a lot of agency, and then I have a lot of agency? And in turn order, you're doing a bid. So if you have a hand of cards, both sides are going to select their first card face down and then flip up, and whoever has the higher card has to go first. So sometimes you really want to go first because you want to achieve something on the map, but then sometimes you want to go second because you get the last play of the turn. So it's an interesting game of chicken there. of guessing and trying to outguess your opponent there. Really, really smart design. I feel like this system is very, very smart. It reminds me a lot of Here I Stand and Virgin Queen, the Ed Beach CDGs, but obviously it's just a two-player game. But it feels like that because it takes the military aspect of those games and really applies it to these theaters of war. It is a buckets of dice system. So you are going to be rolling tons of dice, just like in those games, hitting on 5s and 6s for the most part. And but it never feels egregious. It doesn't feel super swingy. You know, we had some battles in the game where Charles of Austria was run up against de Saxe, and he had outnumbered de Saxe's army near Budweis. And he was moving in from Linz, and I thought for sure it was 9 dice to 5 dice, and then Charles proceeded to roll 9 dice and do 0 hits, and so he was defeated by de Saxe despite having a larger force, and so you can get some of those things happening, but usually defeats are not crushing in the same way that they can be in games where you lose all your units. So in this game, you can actually never take more hits than you have units in your army, and units are either 1 strength point or half a strength point, and you must degrade to half a strength point before you start eliminating units. And so typically you're not seeing these giant wipeout combats. What you're seeing is a combat where someone might win and get an advantage somewhere that they're going to then try and press later, and the loser becomes demoralized, which is similar to maybe the U.S. Civil War or other games of that style, where if you lose a battle and you're demoralized, it has a penalty effect to you. But you can recover those things using your action cards. You can recover units using your action cards. Lines of communication are very important in this game, but it's also very simple. You're just trying to trace back to your capital, Vienna, or your home spaces, as you can see here for Austria. And each of these sort of nations have a capital that you're tracing to, but they also have sort of their own rules around when they come into the game. You can see the turn track here. So in 1742, Naples and Modena join the Bourbon, and then Piedmont, Sardinia joins the Pragmatics. In 1743, you start to see if France might come into the war, or if the Holy Roman Emperor dies. That has a couple of knock-on effects. There's a lot more chrome in this one than there are in other games in the series, as far as I understand it, but I feel like that chrome is really interesting here. Halfway through the game, the French feel like they have the map totally locked down under their control. Saxony's on their side, Bavaria is on their side, the HRE, they can move through there with no problem, and they feel like they own the center of the board. But then, Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, dies. That causes the HRE to then become hostile to the French player, and so now their overstretched supply lines are through hostile territory. Saxony switches sides and comes over to the Pragmatic player. They lose that. Prussia may or may not be in the war. Britain and Hanover are coming from the north, and then you've got the Dutch moving in. It's just a really, really fun sort of dynamic and player environment as you're playing the game. Kind of reminds me of Paths of Glory in that way, where you get these hyper-focused beginning of the game hot zones, Austria and Prussia and France, and then it blows up in balloons as the game goes along. Yeah, I love it. I can't wait to play more games in this series. This is my first go at it. I can't believe I slept on this series so long. There's just a lot of cool stuff about it. There's sort of the abstracted naval control thing is really cool. The British have 2 fleets, and every turn, one can be full strength and one can be half strength. And the French player, they have to spend their resources to either buy new units or potentially buy fleets for that turn, and they can send their fleets out to skirmish with the British fleets. And if they can successfully win those battles, they can take control of the sea areas, and that gives them victory points. And it's just really tense and really exciting. Lots of ways to employ your strategies. I felt, there's a lot of fortresses in here, and sieges are very costly and expensive in this game, because if you don't finish them by the end of the year, you actually have to abandon them and undo all your progress. And I thought that might slow the game down and make it very plodding and sloggy, but I actually didn't feel that way. I felt like the sieges were really interesting, because a lot of the time someone would find an advantage in a region and then start to besiege, a fort that's worth a lot of points. Innsbruck here is worth 2, Munich here is worth 3. There's some bigger ones even. And then you're trying to get that siege done before your opponent can reinforce and replenish their units and the armies and come back and attack you. And so you're really playing kind of a cat and mouse game with your opponent, trying to find those advantage points and leverage them as hard as you can. Just really, really awesome. I'll just zoom in here really quick to show you some of the stuff that happened on the final turn. So Charles of Austria came in. He finally managed to wrench Munich out of the hands of the French, who had kept it even after Bavaria had switched sides. So we managed to grab those. We were having a pretty big, a pretty back and forth conflict here with some of the other Austrian armies. Braun and Tron were down here in sort of the Alpine regions, fighting the Modenese and the Spanish and Neapolitans who had come up from the south, they had managed to, the Austrians had managed to control Italy for most of the game, and then they were in trouble, and they had to pull back, and that allowed the Spanish to grab Tuscany, that allowed the Spanish to grab Parma here, so those were some points, and then we got bogged down, the Austrians got bogged down with Modena, trying to siege it. The Spanish had actually managed to cut the lines of communication for Tron in Milan by taking this space here. What is that? That is Piacenza. And actually, you can see that I didn't manage to take Piacenza back. The Bourbon player managed to take hold of it with some Spanish units there. At the end, Emmanuel of Piedmont ended up coming down. I was trying to, if I had had one more turn, I could have grabbed the 2 points, taking Parma back from the Neapolitans and Spanish. So this was kind of a hot zone near the end of the game, but pretty quiet for the rest of the time. The Piedmontese are a real thorn in the French side. They are in a very strategic location where they can strike at the south of France while the French are busy elsewhere, and that is actually what I ended up doing. We did try and take Toulon a couple times during the game to remove the French Toulon fleet. I just could never make it work. It's hard to siege ports, and the Piedmontese don't quite have the forces to make it easy. But I did manage to get them up here and take Lyon near the end of the game. We managed to grab Avignon. That actually cut the ability of the French to supply their units in the southern part of France. You can see the French players starting to move Broglie and some of the French army down to try and take Lyon back, but by that point, the game was going to be over, so I didn't mind too much. And then up here in the north, the French had a crazy last turn. It actually won them the game. We had Louis XV and Lowendahl, a huge battle against Waldeck and the Duke of Cumberland in Tournai, and we were rolling 10 dice aside, and the French did one more hit than the British did. Unfortunately, that gave them a major victory. And they started besieging Tournai, and with that major victory, that helps your siege, and so they managed to take Tournai. We had a demoralized army under Cumberland, and in that battle, Waldeck, the Dutch commander, actually died. We had the Duke of Orange get attacked here by Coigny and Don Philippe of Spain, who was really far from home on the final turn, and when you win battles with a royal character with the crown, you get victory points, and so Don Philippe scored some points, and so yeah, it was wild. The swing on the final turn was really huge for the Bourbon. I looked like I was in control, and I was hoping that the game would end, but the French managed to claw it back. So. Anyways, that's a lot to say in this after-action report of A Pragmatic War, the War of Austrian Succession. I freaking love it. I cannot wait to play it again, and I cannot wait to play other games in the system. If you haven't checked this out yet, and you like card-driven games, and you like the 18th century, this is, to me, something that I will come back to over and over. It's very playable. This one, you should study the rules on this one a little more. There's a lot of errata to this one, but it's mostly around like the politics and when countries come in and how that affects victory points and stuff. There's not a lot of errata in the components. I do know that there were some counters that were misprinted, but you can get the fixed counters in No Peace Without Honor, which came out last year from Compass, and you can get the fixed counters there. I think there's 4 counters and some control markers. But otherwise, just a super fantastic game, especially if you like this topic. The only other games that I had played on this topic was Maria, which is also a fantastic game. But this one is much more of a military simulation rather than an abstract strategy game. And if you like CDGs, I definitely would give this a try. It is super compelling. This is something that I will probably play at every convention, or I will play, with my friends if we want to play something. Just pull it off the shelf. So I hope you enjoyed this sort of after-action report of a Pragmatic War, and I will be back with some more content soon, possibly from this system.